Today we started a chapter on human settlement and societies. In the last biological anthropology unit, before we started talking about language, we talked about the spread of all human beings or human beings to all areas of the world. And the way that human beings did that was by various adaptations of hunting and gathering. There was no agriculture. Today we're going to be talking about something that we call domestication in terms of the domestication of plants and animals, and how that led to, in some parts of the world, a more intensive form of agriculture. Not all the parts of the world, and actually, even during the rise of intensive agriculture, most people were hunters and gatherers. Some people stayed with small scale crops. So this happened differentially or in different areas. And it also led, we'll talk more about this in the next class when we talk about cities and state governments, but to urban life, the ability to have an agriculture and an agricultural surplus is crucial to having a city. This is Teotihuacan, an ancient city in what is now Mexico. It's actually a very mysterious place because it was founded by people and then they did various things and built some pyramids and stuff and then apparently disbanded. And the name Teotihuacan actually comes to us from the Aztecs who were coming through the area and found this city and were confused by it, would later model some of their own cities on it and claim them as their heritage and name it Teotihuacan. We don't know what the people actually called it. Or your textbook says that there were at least 5 different languages spoken there. Different groups had come into this place. And I point that out in part to say that as we are thinking about these societies and different things happening in different parts of the world and different state governments and urban life, we have to remember that these people were interconnected with each other. And even the people who we might call hunters and gatherers on the fringes of these things were connected to urban life in these cities. Now, you may not know it, but we have all sorts of stereotypes about this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life. Things that just have seeped into our mind and our society when we think about these things. For example, what have you heard? The development of private property. So people are like agriculture, private property, which is kind of true. There's some basis in that. But there's this tendency to fix everything on this agriculture as some huge watershed moment in human life. People who lived in hunting and gathering societies actually had senses of property and land. They might have been more mobile, but there was definitely a sense of territory and what groups belonged to which places. And the people in the early agricultural societies often didn't have as much sense of a private property as we have today. The true notion of private property as land that can be walled and fenced off and I can do whatever I want with actually emerges quite later in human society. That's more of our idea, but we tend to cast it back onto agriculture. And so people tend to think of agriculture in this kind of pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk about some of those, but there's a lot of stereotypes, like I said. You may not realize this about those kinds of societies, and whether you tend to be on one side of the political spectrum, it's seen as the best thing that ever happened because I have private property, or the worst thing that ever happened because now we have private property and people can hoard things and have a hierarchical society. So again, what I'm trying to say is throughout this, I'm going to be trying to mess with some of these stereotypes, which you may not know you have. They come to us from other places and even popular culture, because this has been one of the more debated areas of human life. So let's first talk about how primates live in groups. Do they all live in groups? Yeah, most primates do live in groups because it's mostly advantageous. That is true, except for a few. You're right. It is shocking, these shocking orangutans hanging out by themselves. Mostly it seems like that's due to their spread out food supply. And so in the older days, they may not have been as loner as they are now. But it is true. Primates are a very diverse category. We are mostly social creatures, but there are always some weird ones around, some weird lemurs around or something who are not so social. There are a few drawbacks to living in a group. Anybody experience a drawback of living in a group recently? How many times have you gotten COVID so far? The spread of infectious diseases, right, is a disadvantage to living in a group. But for the most part, primates do live in groups. What are these primates doing? What are they up to? What are they looking out for? Any threats? Yes, they're ready to defend their territory against predators. So this is a big advantage to living in a group, especially if you're a primate living in a predatorial environment. This is what happens. In human beings, we see this extended to what they call prosocial behavior. So there's social behavior, hanging out in groups and defending your group against threats. But prosocial behavior means you help the group even if it might not be to your individual advantage, or you might not be getting anything necessarily individually out of it, but you're still helping the group. And especially among human beings, we do our kinship in terms of a social order. Yes, we call people terms that are biologically related to us, but we extend this in different ways and include or exclude different people from the group. We will talk about this much more later on when we specifically talk about kinship, but they do mention it here in terms of how people talk about their kin and their groups and how they extend that onto a larger category than just what we might call the nuclear family or our immediate family that we share genes with. Humans they're more extensive in the way in which they think about their groups. So we have these hunter and gatherer societies. This is the way people spread out all over the world. Yeah, there were these small groups. They use a big word, which is egalitarian. So until around 12,000 years ago, they mainly lived in pretty small groupings. They would come together every so often. But the word here that they use is egalitarian. Now, egalitarian doesn't mean that everybody's completely equal. There are still differences, probably gender differences, age differences, differences in power and status. But it's not, people aren't able to hugely accumulate those differences in the way that they can in agricultural societies and make it into personal private property. So we have this relatively egalitarian grouping societies. And they get their food through knowing about what wild plants and animals are up to and knowledge of that and that cultural transmission of that knowledge and learning over time. Now, in hunter-gatherer groups, there is actually lots of pro-social behavior. You have to cooperate in order to hunt and gather. You have to interact. And they're actually fairly diverse societies in terms of people being able to come and go. Certainly, kinship, being biologically related to somebody, was an important part of hunter-gatherer ties. Being a member of the group was often, or your status in the group was related to your family and where you were in there. But we've discovered that when we look at hunter-gatherer societies today and in the recent past and probably back through time, that these are pretty highly mobile societies and people can come in and out of them. And so many of these groups actually had more people who were not biologically related to each other than they had people who were. And so it's a mistake to think back onto the time of hunter-gatherers as a time in which people were always concerned with their immediate kin or their family, and that was how they organized everything. In fact, you had pretty fluid societies spanning pretty large territories. And so people actually probably traveled more and were more mobile, comparatively speaking, even than people are today. Now, something happens, Ice Age ends, and the planet begins to warm. So we have the end of the last glacial period of around 12,000 years ago, bringing us into what we call the Holocene epoch. It is probably true that we could not have had agriculture before about 12,000 years ago in terms of how the climate was. It was simply too cold in many parts of the world and too unstable to grow things on the scale that we can, or we could and can today. And so about 12,000 years ago, we have this changing climate leading to a warmer climate, which is more stable than it was in the past. For those of you who are thinking, well, maybe we should have a little more, we should get a little warmer yet. I'd be careful with that. Human beings have never lived at the kinds of temperatures that we're projecting into the next 50 or 100 years. But at the time of the Holocene, this did create some good opportunities for human beings. The largest mammals and the largest, what we call the megafauna, did go extinct at this time. Now, some people say that was because of the expansion of human beings into these areas and some of these megafauna, the big sloths and mammoths and things, which would seem like they were difficult to hunt, but they didn't have many predators before. And so some people speculate that it was humans moving into these areas that killed off the big animals that we are so fun to look at. Other people say that these creatures may have died out because of the changing climate. So there's still some debate about why that is. But what happens is there are new areas opening up for fast-growing plants and animals that could live in the Holocene environment. So the largest, the megafauna, disappear, but other plants and animals proliferate during this time. And before there is any sort of domestication or agriculture, the beginning of the Holocene is actually a wonderful time to be a hunter and a gatherer, because you have these new climates opening up and new areas for plants and animals to develop. So eventually we're going to be talking about land cultivation. But before we do that, I just want to point out, again, it's a stereotype that hunter-gatherers just go around following plants and animals around, and they don't have much relationship with the land. We actually know now that hunter-gatherers are very actively involved in managing their plant and animal populations and in encouraging the growth of the plants and animals that they want to have in their environment. So we see this in, for example, the ways in which the Aboriginals of Australia manage their coastal resources. And we see that in the United States, for example, or in North America, where the Native Americans or the indigenous people here often used fire as a way of reshaping entire landscapes and would burn out areas of the forest so that the different plants and animals would regrow and proliferate there. And what was interesting is that people didn't realize this. The Europeans came over and they thought that this was some untouched Garden of Eden. But once the Native Americans were displaced from this landscape, a lot of things went wrong with it. And so it was only later that they realized that they were actually using things like fire in order to reshape an entire landscape as a large area for hunting and gathering. So the people in these areas were very in touch with and not only with their environments, but they were transforming them as well. In different parts of the world, there were plants and animals that became available to what we call the domestication process. So your book gives you the example of maize or corn, which was domesticated in what is now Mexico and Central America. And you can see there that the original corn, or teosinte, doesn't have many kernels. But over time, humans select for what we would call favorable mutations. And I put the word favorable in quotes because these mutations are not good for the plant in the wild. In the wild, you want to spread that seed out all over the place, and you don't want to have, there are mutations for this corn which make it those seeds bigger and more pliable, but in the wild, that would not be advantageous for the plant. But by selecting these mutations that are favorable for humans, and these occur in certain plants but not in others, which is why certain things were domesticated and other plants were not, it leads to a mutual codependence. And so this corn cannot survive without human intervention. And so the corn becomes dependent on humans while the humans become dependent on the corn. One interesting thing is if you look out over the world, so domestication, we often think, or agriculture, we often think of it as one thing that happened, and we are most familiar with what happened in what is now the Middle East, where wheat and barley were domesticated, and cows and sheep and goats. But it happened in different parts of the world at around the same time. So again, after this Holocene warming took place, but they domesticated the stuff that was available in their areas of the world. And so, yes, we have rice in Asia, we have the potato in South America, we have corn in Mesoamerica. And it was only later that some of these agricultural innovations spread to different regions. They were independently domesticated in this area. And so we have around the same time, but we have very different species of plants and animals that are available and amenable to human domestication. And as I said, once that domestication process gets going, then you have this dependency that develops between the humans who become, in the case of agriculture, quite dependent on these species. But the domesticated species also then need the humans to survive and proliferate because they've changed in some ways that they will not be able to proliferate in the wild.